and I head up the Institute for Creative Conversation in Benoni in South Africa. And my colleagues Anne and Natasha and Heather are part of this group as well. We really teach and have a passion for stories, people's stories, and the narrative therapy. And so when Anne discovered Liezel on Facebook, with the kind of the narrative stitching, well, our interest was definitely piqued, and Anne made contact, and we're delighted, Liezel, to have you join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and over to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Liezel, as you know. You can hear that I'm very South African, but I live in Scotland. I moved over here in 2014, so I've been here about 8 years now. And I am a writer. I used to be a nurse. I trained in South Africa, in Cape Town. Did most of my practicals at the hospitals in Cape Town, studied at UWC, and I had my little boy there. And not too long after that, left South Africa and came to Scotland. My son is autistic, and he's a type 1 diabetic, so he's got quite a lot of needs that require his mum to be pretty hands-on, and I also homeschool him, so he's my big focus. And in the times that I have spare time, I'm a writer, and I do writing for well-being groups, which I really love, because I really believe in the power of storytelling, and I believe in the power of stories that we all hold. Now, the project that got Anne really excited is my Words for Elizabeth. Words with Elizabeth is the project name, and I'll tell you more about that. I have a series of poems that I wrote, and the subtitle to them is Words with Elizabeth. And those poems are all poems that are very, very personal. Most of my work that I write about is obviously, I write from a very, very personal space, but these are almost conversations with myself and conversations with the other women in my family. And the reason I use the name Elizabeth is that that is a very popular family name. So we have a lot of Elizabeths running around in our family. And also the name Liezel is the diminutive of Elizabeth. So Words with Elizabeth is words with myself and all the women who come before me. And I decided the project is Words with Elizabeth, and it focuses on primarily my childhood memories of growing up in a home with domestic violence. So domestic violence in my family, unfortunately, is something that is very, very prevalent and has been very prevalent, generational. There is not a single, maybe there's one or two, but for the most part, most families running off my main family line have an experience of domestic violence. So there's a lot of different stories that make up that big story. And I wanted to honor these people. I wanted to honor their voices. I wanted to honor their stories. And I didn't quite know how to do that in a way that would not completely throw open stories that were not my story to tell. Because that's the other thing that is very important to me, is that I really believe that we need to tread carefully around other people's stories, and domestic violence is never one person's story. It's always a family story, and there are always stories there that I think need to be treated with great respect and great caution. For myself, I had the experience where my family was really thrown into the media. My dad was killed during a domestic violence incident with my mum. And so that catapulted us and our family and our secrets and all the things that we didn't want everyone to know. It just pushed us into the media, several years ago. And it was an incredibly difficult thing. And the project, the stitching, has helped me to explore some of the stories that I explored in therapy with therapists, but it allowed me to explore in a way that I could tell the story, because I think it's very important that we're able to tell our stories to people. But it is a very difficult thing to be vulnerable and to open yourself up. And this is what the stitching allowed me to do. It was never a project that I thought was going to be this visible. I started sharing some of it on my author page, and I was completely taken aback by the response that I got. I honestly did not think that people would pay so much attention. And I just, from the minute that I started sharing, I started an album on my author page and on my website, and I just started getting messages, and people responded in the comments section. But the thing that I responded the most to emotionally were the messages that I was getting from people. There were people who were still in domestic violence situations and saying, "Thank you for doing this, that's me." And there were people who would leave anonymous messages on my website and say, "Thank you for doing this, that's me." And I realized that this is a very, very important thing. It's not a topic we like to talk about because it's not a lovely topic. It's not a beautiful topic. There's no ways you can dress domestic violence up. It cannot be dressed up. The only thing you can do with it is throw it open. And I think that this project has allowed that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run you through some slides, give you an idea of what I do. The most important thing I like people to know is that it's such an accessible thing, the stitching. I was telling Anne and Nicky before the meeting started that stitching is not my my field that I'm comfortable in at all. As a child at school, my needlework teacher, I think she was very relieved when I chose when I chose not to carry on with huishoudkunde. What is that in English? I can't even remember. But you all know what I'm talking about. I realized that this was not for me, and I left that. And it's quite a standard joke in my family that I now enjoy knitting and stitching. Everyone's like, "What? You're doing what?" So, yeah, it's very accessible. If I don't know if any of you are focused on therapy from a therapeutic point of view and you work with people, it's a very, very powerful adjunct to therapy where you are sitting with someone, with a client in a therapeutic environment, because it's something that can be taken home and it can be done at home. And what I have found with myself, and I'll explore that with you, is that it becomes a different, another mouth. The project that I have is an apron. I have quite a collection of vintage clothing. I have a bit of a thing for it. And I wanted specifically to have an item of clothing that had a particular look and thread and purpose. And the apron is a very threadbare, and it has holes in it. And I've stitched around it, and I've stitched my story and other people's stories. And I've done so in a way that it has literally just become another mouth. Now, I'm not somebody who really needs another mouth because I talk a hang of a lot. I'm pretty comfortable with talking, but it really has become a place where I can go and I can put things onto. And there's been no purpose to it. I don't plan the stitches. I don't plan anything. I pick it up and I allow what's in me to come, and I just, stitch it on. And it's not something that I work on all the time. It's almost like a fabric journal. And it's a very, very powerful tool. Certainly in the one group on Facebook, I belong to a slow stitching group. And I know that there were several ladies there that have said to me as well, "This is a wonderful idea. I'm going to use this." I know one lady had experienced sexual violence, and she said that she was going to use this idea and work in her own therapeutic way through her stories with that. And I love that, because it really just is such a powerful little thing to do, powerful tool. So if I may, I'm going to do the slides, Nikki. I'm going to start the slides, and then I can show you, introduce you to my apron and show you what I do. Okay. Get you to the beginning. There we go. So Words with Elizabeth, the narrative stitching project about my childhood memories of domestic violence. This is the center of the apron. As you can see, there is absolutely no plan, it's not a project that is focused on skill. It's not a project that's focused on particular types of stitches. It is me. The colors I use are distinctive. I focus a lot on different reds, and I focus a lot on black as well. Now this is in the center of the apron on the band. This poem is a poem that I wrote several years ago, and it was taken up and printed in a journal, a magazine here in the UK called Brenda Magazine. And I'll read it to you. The color of your love blooms red on my lip, and I walked into the door again last night. All your holy promises hidden from the light, the secret soft parts of me where you empty out your fight. Remember to remember, a blue forget-me-not, that I belong to you until death do us part. And this poem, you'll see with the next slides, I embroidered onto the band of the apron. So basically that is the thing that holds, that goes around the waist and positions this in place. You'll see that the fabric, what I did with the fabric is I purposefully threw red wine on it. I don't want to make it sound like I did some dip dyeing fancy artistic thing. I literally took this thing and I threw red wine on it, because again, from a storytelling point of view in my family, there's not a single domestic violence situation where alcohol was not at the heart of it. Now, this is obviously not the case for everyone, but for my family it was. So I wanted that to be present. I wanted some presence of that driver in the domestic violence process in my family. I wanted their presence. So all these dark stains that you see are all alcohol, red wine. The thread that I've got, I don't know if you can see where I'm moving with my cursor, the thread that I've got through there, I've put that through and it runs the entire band and it runs through the entire apron. And what I was trying to show there is this thread. And there are parts where the thread is double in an effort to acknowledge that people come together in relationships and they are people with stories. And even the perpetrator of domestic violence, even the abuser, has a story. So this is not to condone what is done, but it is to see the humanity in even the abuser. And that can be a very difficult thing for people, particularly when they're right in that raw situation. For myself, it was a very healing thing to realize that my mum comes with a story and my dad comes with a story. And to be able to separate myself from their stories. And that took me a very, very, very long time. And even now as an adult with a degree in nursing science and psychiatric nursing and studying towards counseling, it's still something that I have to engage and say, this is not me. This was two other people who happened to be my parents. And I love both very much. And I think that is another thing that is very difficult for people to understand. is that you can have, particularly when it's your parents, that you can experience things and still love that person. And that's an important thing to acknowledge. So there we go. That is the center of the apron. You can see the stains, the red wine very, very nicely now. You can see the knots. You can see where the thread, where I've purposefully not pulled the thread through, to show where we sometimes step out of our lives, step out of our stories. That's the band that carries on, and the thread running through, all the way through. And that is the middle, the complete center of the apron. This is the last piece I've worked on. I'm still working on the stitches around it. And I sat with the theme of nobody will believe you for a long time. And I think that is one of the really powerful aspects of coercive control, is that the abuser will use this. And certainly that was the case in my home, where my dad, whom I loved very much, but who was, when he was drinking, a very different person. You know, you get your folk who drink a lot and become jolly and the life of the party, and then you get others who don't, unfortunately. For me, what caused me much confusion as somebody who has faith in God, who grew up in the church, I think for me the difficult part was the abuse would happen, and then on a Sunday we would be sitting in church. And that was a very difficult thing to work through as a child. And even now as an adult, it's something I explore very often in my writing, because I don't think it is something that is quite as singular as what I have always thought it was. It's definitely something that a lot of people question. Now this is in Afrikaans, so I should have actually given a little warning as to this for the folk who understand Afrikaans. What I did with the apron as well is that I literally took phrases, literally took sentences, words that were spoken, and these were things that are like little burrs, little thorns, things that are given to you, particularly as a child, things that are said to you in an experience, in a particular situation. It becomes a thing that sits in your subconscious. And I found putting it out, actually the act of stitching, putting it out onto this apron was incredibly powerful. It really was. It was literally taking it out and putting it onto this apron. And these are memories that are many, many years old. And yeah, this particular slide, I debated long whether I would put it up. First of all, because it's Afrikaans, I didn't want to spend a lot of time translating it on my author page. But at the same time, I wanted to be very honorable to that was said to me as a child in a particular situation, because it was something that really shaped who I am today. This is a slide as well, the next slide, the help. If you look very carefully, you can see that I embroidered help in white thread. So you have to actually hold the apron in your hands to actually see this, because I've enlarged it quite a lot. So many people responded to this slide. And I think it is a very, very powerful thing where people just, we're all walking around with this in us, and so many of us are shouting help. We don't know how to get it out. We don't know how to say it. We don't know if people are listening. I think that's the other thing. If you say help, if you shout help, is somebody listening? Is someone going to do something about it? So this was a very powerful slide in terms of my response that I got from folk. And I've embroidered the word in several places, tiny little hidden helps all over the apron. I'll slide you through here. And this one was another one which really just evoked a lot of response. I had a lot of feedback, a lot of interaction. because I think a lot of people who live with domestic violence, who live with chronic illness, who live with all sorts of things weighing on them, that is like a standard response. I'm fine. People say, how are you? I'm fine. I'm fine. But we carry this thing. We carry this incredible weight, whatever the weight is, and we all have the weight. And I wanted this to be on there. For us as a family, this is obviously many years ago. And I think I was having this conversation with somebody online where a lady was saying that she lived with domestic violence for so many years and she eventually managed to get out. But now her daughter is caught in the same situation. And we had this discussion about how obviously things were very different. I'm thinking in terms of my granny who experienced it as well. But things were very, very different then for women. They didn't have the protection even of the law. It wasn't that long ago in South Africa that the whole domestic violence, there is a precedent that comes in where you as the victim can go to the police station and sign an affidavit before the time and say, I'm experiencing domestic violence, and I don't know the proper legal term for it. My mum did this. So that the police will then caution the person and say, listen, we have this thing legally. So if the person calls through and says, I'm in trouble, we can just come. We don't ask questions, we just arrest you. Now that was a very long time in coming in South Africa, and that is in place. I don't always know how effectively it works. I'd hate to big it up as something tremendous, but at least from a legal point of view, that is in place. I think in terms of, it wasn't too long ago where a wife couldn't be raped by her husband, where the police would knock on the door, and if it was anything domestic, they would just say, well, you guys sort it out behind closed doors. Also, I think for those who follow my work, you'll see that I do push back quite a lot against the church. So not against faith, but against the church, because we certainly as a family knocked on the door of the church a lot, and we didn't get much support there. My father was very very active in the church, very influential in the church, and yeah, I'll get to, you'll see over here, I'll talk about that one. But this is the other narrative that you get often. You know, I didn't mean it. And that's supposed to just deflate it all. And then the flip side of that, you get the sorry, the sorry, the sorry, the sorry, the sorry. And then you get the, but you asked for it. And again, another slide that a lot of people responded to with stories. And I've had some really, really heartbreaking stories from people. So here we go, Anne. That's the slide I think that you spoke about. Another slide that a part of the apron, I wasn't sure whether I should share. That was my initial thing, was should I share this? Should I not share this? Because I want to be vulnerable. I want to open it up. I want to tell the story, but at the same time, I don't want to add to this burden of stuff on social media. And I'm also, because I'm like that, very cautious about putting stuff up that somebody else is going to go, oh, I now need to go off and try and forget what I saw. So in some homes, forks are only used for eating. And when I typed up the notes that went with this, I said, some of you will know exactly what I mean here. And others were like, oh, what do you mean by this? And I'm grateful for both. I'm grateful that there were folk who said, I know exactly what you mean. And I'm grateful that there were people who go, I don't understand what you're saying. Because I thought it's a lovely thing that there are folk who don't know what I'm saying. But there are people who do know. And those are the people that I'm doing this for. And I'll explain, I'll read something afterwards in relation to this line. This was where I started. Before I started getting to this point in the apron, I was very much exploring memories of family members and stories that were told to me of family members experiencing, this was where I really started touching on my own childhood memories. So this was a very difficult thing for me to stitch, and it was a very difficult thing for me to put up on social media. And yeah, you can see it's not, my home ec teacher would probably still stand by her original opinion of my embroidery skills if she saw this. But yeah, as I said, there's no ways that you can pretty up domestic violence in any way. You can tell the story. So here we go. You must submit to your husband. Was a line that was given to my mum by the Dominee. We were Dutch Reformed, okay, where there was just no interest at all at that time, many years ago. It was basically just, we don't want to know. This is what God says you must do. And if you do this, God will sort it all out. But we know that God doesn't sort it out in this way, and that this is a very complex thing. And it's a very complex thing, I think, for the church as well to explore. But I do know from my personal experience, my own experience, that a lot of things are brushed under the carpet by saying this is what God wants you to do. So we have to be very cautious there as people of faith, what we do with these stories. You were born mad and you will die mad was something that was said to somebody whom I love very much, and it was always the standard. Nothing about you matters. Your story doesn't matter. Nobody will listen to your story. And this links very much to the middle part of nobody will believe you. This, I think, people who are familiar with the term gaslighting will also know that this is a very powerful gaslighting tool. This is the full apron. So I apologize for the quality of this photograph. It's quite difficult to get the whole thing in. You'll see there is absolutely no plan to it whatsoever. It's literally like a child's got hold of it and just went and stitched everywhere. I've got quite a few corners still to fill. I'm hoping for it to be accepted as part of an art exhibition, which will be held in Edinburgh later this year as part of a mental health charity here in Scotland. So there is still, it's a work in progress. There's still a lot that will get added to it, but that will give you an idea of what it looks like and what I've done with it. In the corner at the bottom, don't think I put an individual slide in. In the corner right at the bottom where you can see my cursor, I've embroidered the word slut. And I embroidered that word in because, again, that was a word that was given to somebody as part of the story, and it highlighted the insecurity that I think sometimes, often, sits within the abuser. This is a person who was accused of standing in her pajamas, in her nightie, in a revealing nightie, so that other people, other men could see her, regardless of the fact that the house didn't border on a street, didn't border anywhere that anybody could see. So again, the power of the word and how it keeps people captive. So there we go. What I want to do in relation to the slide, in some home, forks are only used for eating. I'm going to read something to you, and this is what I wrote and shared with that particular slide on social media. And that line, as I said, was the first line where I explored my own memories as vulnerably as I could. The body remembers. The body remembers everything, both good and bad. And she holds on to it, planting it in tiny pockets all over herself. She hides it well, but she doesn't like to let go of things And sometimes she has a hard time remembering the lovely things, the kind things, finding it easier to pick up the sharp things by their thorns. They stick into the skin so much better. They can't just be blown away by a soft exhale. She thinks she might need them again when she needs to warn you of danger or trouble, or maybe someone who wants to come closer to your heart or to your life. She thinks she's protecting you. She does. And one day, you might be sitting at your kitchen table where you never work, but here you are working on an old piece of fabric that once graced another woman's skin, heard another woman's stories, and you might hear a soft voice inside your chest, and she might sound like a young girl, and she might sound familiar, and she might whisper, "Remember how it happened in the kitchen. Remember how the kitchen was never the same. Remember how you could never sit on that side of the table without your throat closing up like an open clam, threatened perhaps with an ordinary fork, a thing to eat a meal with, but also a weapon, held against your face, all the fear, how your legs stopped working, how your heart wanted to rip away out of your chest, how your brain curled up into a ball and didn't know what to do, how you tried to walk around the memory on tiptoe with light feet, how you sat in church the next day singing, "Holy, holy, holy is the name of the God you were given," how you wonder at the Bible held open on his lap, and the fork, the fork, the fork. Do you remember now? And you might look up from the stitch you were about to make in honor of yourself, in honor of the others. A small thing, this remembering, but see how it casts a big shadow, and she's shaped like healing and things you cannot begin to know. But the fabric listens to your hands, listens to your fingers, and it tells the stitches, here and here and here is where you must go. And you see the soft snow falling outside, the fat flakes swirling towards the earth, and there is Beethoven on the radio, the candle blooming a sweet vanilla flame on the windowsill, and you in your own warm kitchen, a womb, and within arm's reach, a drawer full of forks used only for eating. That was a very powerful thing for me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, which is an ordinary kitchen table and is used for ordinary things. And I was sitting there working, not at my desk. And all of a sudden, this thought just came to me that the very line that I was working on was about a child experience that happened in the kitchen. And how, as I've said there, once it happened, the kitchen was never the same. Even as an adult, later returning to my childhood home, whenever I walked into the kitchen, it was like this first thing that would come subconsciously along with everything else, but that was always there. And how sitting in my kitchen now, stitching this project, it felt like I was undoing the power of that. There we go. So that's my project. That's my story. I could go on for hours and hours. I told Nicky she's gonna have to rein me in.
Well, Liezel, thank you for sharing part of your story. You mentioned allowing yourself to be vulnerable, and I'm just wondering, now that you've shared it with us, those of us that are here, what has it been like?
I think I've slowly shared over the last month. The story certainly, I think for me, the big thing was my dad's death. That was a very difficult thing. That happened as an adult. So the whole, the memories around the actual domestic violence are very much childhood centered, and a lot of them go into my adulthood, but I was not present in the home. I'd moved out by then. But obviously things kept happening. So there is a trove of things, but I think it all came to a very big head on that situation where, you know, my dad died in that situation. And that took me a very long time to even be able to write about publicly, because that for me, I was tussling with a story. It's my story, but it's not only my story. And then also you have this thing that you want to protect people in the story. What I found for myself with telling it is to negotiate how to paint a portrait of my dad that is not only seen as a villain, because none of us are. None of us are, and that I think, again, is something that is difficult for people to fully understand. Is I've had people say, but how can you still love your dad if you went through this? I can. He's my dad. I only had one dad. And it's a very important thing, I think, to acknowledge, because when we can get that out, when we can acknowledge that, we either humanize or rehumanize the person. And it's a very important thing to be able to do that. When I was in my 4th year at university, my dad died. So it was a difficult time in that I was in the middle of my nursing degree, and I was in the middle of studying a very big, important unit that was part of my psychiatric nursing on gender-based violence. And here this thing just happened. And nobody, barring my very, very immediate family, knew of these experiences. And all of a sudden, I wasn't even in South Africa when it happened. I was in an exchange program. I was in Sweden. So it happened, and I had to try and find my way back to South Africa amidst this whole situation. There was obviously court cases which carried on for 2 years. There was media, there was newspapers, there was people. It was something that I think my instinct was to just try and run away from, you know, just try and get away from, but you can't get away from that, from something of that magnitude. And once it's been thrown open in the newspapers and things, it gets a life of its own. And so it kind of forces you to deal with things. So that was a very difficult thing for me to try and open up about, Nicky. And I started writing about it about 2-3 years ago. I slipped. It's always in my writing. I use a lot of analogy, a lot of metaphor in my writing. So it's always there in a lot of my work. But unless you actually know, you wouldn't know. And then I thought, you know, I've got to, it is this second mouth that tells stories, and I have to open it up. And when I did, the first time I wrote about it and said, look, this is the situation, you know, my mum picked up a gun and shot my dad. And people were just so incredibly lovely. They were so kind and so, I in my head, I don't know why, but I had this thing that people were going to all just unfollow my page and stop reading my work. And I don't know what I expected to happen, but it was completely the contrary. People were just, I think people were really moved by the vulnerability, because it took an incredible amount for me to do that. And I have a writing group which I facilitate as well, and it's called Chasing Brave. And I'm always encouraging folk in that group to write as vulnerably as they can, to throw it open. They don't have to throw it open completely publicly. We need to do things when we're ready and, you know, when the situation is ready. But to tackle those things head on and to write about them and to tell the stories. Yeah.
So in a sense, you're taking that step to be vulnerable was also an invitation, if I'm hearing you correctly, for others.
Yes,
to,
absolutely.
To be vulnerable too.
Absolutely. That is the heart of my work as a writer. It is absolutely the heart of my work, is to show people that you can have these stories. And again, we all have these stories, and we have these hidden layers and layers and layers. And we are shaped by our parents' stories, by our grandparents' stories. And I think for us, particularly in Western society, we've lost that. We've lost that connection with the people who've come before. We don't honor our ancestors. We don't honor the ones who've come before and their stories and the fabric that they are. And it is very important that we do, because they were shaped by someone else. And through sheer genetics, you are born into a family. And in that family, in that life, things are going to happen to you, and some are going to be beautiful and some are going to be terrible. And it is your response where you are able, because obviously I'm not saying that people just need to, buck up and smile and get through it. Where you are able to work through that, it is an important thing that we do that. Yeah. So to encourage folk to do that, to be vulnerable with what they have, and to be honest with what they have, because again, social media is another tool that has taken that honesty away. We see every single day, we see little squares of people's lives that are not quite as honest, I think, as what people think they are.
And going on this journey for yourself, because it sounds like initially it was part of your own healing journey, your own journey in therapy. What effect has it had on members of your family whose stories are also caught up in your story?
No one has said anything. It's not something that anybody has said anything about. Before I wrote about my dad's death, I said to my mum, I need to write about this. I have to do something. I will write as respectfully as I can. So I wanted her permission on that, because it was obviously a situation that completely polarized my family. It completely split the family. It caused a whole lot of dynamic that we have, I think, in many instances still not recovered from. But in terms of the stitching project, I think possibly people just let me get on with it because they know that I'm going to just get on with it anyway. It's not, yeah. Maybe it would be different if I was still in South Africa, where I don't have really have family here. So possibly it would have been a different thing if I was sitting in a lounge working on it in front of someone. But yeah, I've always been very respectful of that, knowing that it is not just my story. I think that is a very important thing. I think it's Anne Lamott who wrote that if people wanted me to write about them better, they should have treated me better, or something like that. And it's quite a popular line with writers, and I've always kind of like pulled back from it, because there is truth in that. But at the same time, I think there is a way to negotiate stories that acknowledges that behind every story, like I have a story, my dad had a story, and there were layers that I did not know about. And that shaped him.
I guess I just have one more question, and then Anne, I'd like to hand over to you if you have questions. And perhaps just to say at this point that if anybody who's with us might have a question, if they'd like to type it in the chat box, so that we can try and get to those as well. So there's obviously the gift you have of writing, but then with the narrative stitching, I kind of been wondering about what your process is. It seems to be the apron is being filled over time.
Yes.
How do you go about that? Is it as memories come up? Do you find yourself starting with the writing of pieces first, and then it triggers something to add to the apron? How do you go about that?
My writing process, I believe in starting for myself. This is what works for me creatively. I start my day by just writing it all out on paper. So I get rid of whatever's been distilling there overnight, and I write it down on paper, and that's where a lot of my poems and pieces come from. And I'm a people watcher. So if I'm in the shop, if I'm having a cup of coffee or a cup of tea somewhere, I'm an absolute avid people watcher. So I love to observe people and see what they do, how they live their lives, how they respond. I love to see how a dad picked up a dummy and gave it to his baby in the middle of the shop. All of these things to me are the bones of stories. With the apron, I just let it come to me. I don't go and explore it. I've got a lot of other stitching work that I do. I stitch my poetry onto vintage baby dresses. So I've got a lot of stitching that I do, but this project is very different in that it's there. It's always visible. It's always with me, but I let it dictate. Again, this would probably be different for someone else if their journey was still very raw and very fresh. For me, it's something from a long time ago, and I let those come. Maybe I have a conversation with an aunt or with my mum, and she mentions, "Oh, Auntie so and so," you know, and that will trigger something, and then I'll go, "Oh, I remember that," you know, and then something will come. So I'm very hands off, and for myself, I'm somebody who needs to be in control. I think many people who've grown up in homes where there has been some form of abuse become somebody who has a deep need for control, to control your situation, to control what you think is coming towards you. So with the apron, I literally, and that is a very decisive process, I'm very hands off in that. I don't pick it up and go, "Oh, I wonder what I can stitch." Not at all. The thought comes, the memory comes, and then I go, "I'm going to stitch it." I hope that answers.
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Anne?
Thank you. I'm just fascinated that you expanded so much. Is Liezel still there?
Yes, I'm here.
There you go. Yeah. you moved. You picked up on the fork story and you expanded on that, and that was what first attracted my attention. And I want to just pick up on what Nicky was asking you, because last night you posted something, I think it was only last night, and there was just the word loved.
Loved, yes.
And I sat with that for so long, and I loved the words that you used about how they came to you and how did, I can't remember the exact word, but it had kind of been walking beside you the whole day, and you just felt that to stitch it. Maybe you can just talk a little bit about that happened, that you stitched the word loved.
So that the word that you saw that I stitched last night that I shared is part of a vintage baby dress that I'm working on at the moment. And the center of that dress is a poem that I wrote for my son. And so I've got the word loved running through it, and I'm basically going to be covering the whole dress. You are loved, 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 loved. And it's a very, I wanted to share that word because, partly because of all the stuff that is just happening in the world right now. I think there's just so much where people want to draw away from, where people, particularly on social media, it's this influx where I've literally made a choice to not be on social media too much in the last few days, because it becomes almost a vicarious trauma when you have all of this at you. And with my work, I always say that I give my words work to do. I don't like to just add to this body that's out there. I like to add to the body with purpose. And so when I share things, it's because I feel I've sat with something, I've sat with a word, I've sat with words, and I have a very strong feeling that it needs to go out and it needs to be shared. And that has never failed me. Whether me as a person of faith, whether that's God saying, I want you to do that, I don't question these things. I just, when I have this, and I know I have to do it. And sometimes it's 1 o'clock in the morning and I share that thing, and it finds ground, it finds a heart. Even if it's one heart, even if it's one person who opens up their social media on a particularly bad day and they see that one word, or that one sentence, "You are loved." That to me is that's my words having done the work that they're supposed to do. And I'm finding the stitching is, it gives you that visual that matches with it. Yeah.
And I think, you know, I hear the context in which you wrote it, and yet it can meet anyone's context. So I just found that so amazing.
Yeah.
And I think what your stitching does, it gives, like poetry has a similar effect. You know, it gives you other words to express something that you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I think just a comment on the embroidery. You said, you know, your domestic science, that's what we used to call it in my
Yes.
day.
Huishoudkunde in Afrikaans.
Yeah. To me, there's a real rawness, you know, that it's not perfect is what it should be. And that's what really attracted me to it, was you can see the stitching behind, and there are pieces hanging, you know, and that says so much, and your color choices. So I think that, you know, the whole that says I am fine, and there's a hole, and the red denotes, well, the meaning I take from that is blood, maybe. You know, so there's such a lot of meaning, and that rawness and that vulnerability is just so amazing. It's captivating, yeah. And then I also wanted to say I can't wait for your book to come out, and maybe you can let us know how we can get hold of it, because I'm really looking forward to it. But you have written 2 other books.
Yes, I've published 2 collections of poetry, and I'm now working on my 3rd. The 3rd one will be out in July, and that's going to be poetry, but I've got a lot more of my longer pieces in there. So it leans towards prose poetry and some essays as well. So I'm not sure how it's going to be received, because I know my first book, in terms of the one that people reference the most and write to me about, that one has been the most popular book. But that book was very much an introspective exploration of myself and finding myself. And the poems were mostly fairly short. So I think they appeal to a certain reader who wants to pick up and be nourished by something short and then put it down. I have had people say to me, my poems are too long to read. So I'm not entirely sure how the 3rd book's going to go, but it's important to me that the stories and the things in there get told. You know, I mean, you can't as a writer appeal to everyone. It's absolutely impossible. And it's important to me that I obviously stick and honor my stories and my words, and I know that they will find where they need to go. So yeah, so that's July.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll keep in touch, and we'll let everyone know.
Excellent.
So all right, you carry on, Nicky. I see there's some messages. Yeah.
Just from Dawn. Dawn just says, I'm fascinated that you chose an apron for this project.
Hi, Dawn. The reason I chose the apron was that I wanted writing as a woman. In my family, it's not just the women who experienced domestic violence. Some of the men were victims at the hands of female partners. And it's important that we obviously acknowledge that, because I think that's a very hidden segment in the domestic violence narrative. But writing as a woman, and because the predominant experiences were those of women in my family, I wanted a piece of clothing that had almost a subservient servant aspect to it. And I have so many items that I looked at. Should I use this? Should I do that? And it was just this apron, and that was why. And I wanted it. I chose it as well because it was very threadbare. Had been used. It was literally in parts. It's almost falling apart. So to me, that was part of the narrative. Was there is this thing that is functional, that looks functional and looks like it's able to do what it's supposed to do, but it's falling apart. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wanted to, if you'd like, oh, there's somebody else. Who's that? Natasha says, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your story with us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And then Sarah, who's in the UK, writes, I'm sorry for being late. Thank you, Liezel. I'm preaching on the misquoting of the Ephesians line, wives submit and children honor your parents, and the damage that misquoting continues to do in homes. How do people of faith, or, come on, go down. Oh,
here we go. I'm reading it as well. How do people of faith, or people who have left faith because of the horrors of these Ephesian lines used as weapons, how do they receive your work? Thank you. Sarah, thank you for the question. Thank you for bringing that up. I'll give you a little background. I know we're running out of time. I grew up in the Dutch Reformed Church, very, very conservative Afrikaans home. And I left the Dutch Reformed for the Charismatic Church. So I went from one extreme to the other. And over the years, I got to the place where I had to really find my way. And where I am now, I can see the damage that a lot of these misquoted scriptures do. And I can see the damage retrospectively. There were a lot of things, I think, for myself that I believed as a woman were the right things, were the true things, because there was always a man telling me that this is what God says. And it's a very tricky thing. And I know I write about my relationship with the church, and with that very patriarchal aspect, I write about that in my work very often. And I do occasionally get some pushback. I'm not somebody who goes and I'm very honest about my writing. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an apologist. I'm literally somebody who tells my story. So it's going to sit with some people, and it sits with more people than it doesn't sit with. I've had folk stop reading my work because they realize that I'm a Christian. And then I've had people stop reading my work because they realize I'm a Christian, but I'm not a Christian like them. So either way, it used to bother me tremendously in the beginning. And then I thought, well, I can either walk around with my experiences and my stories and not share them because I'm scared someone's going to get offended. Or I can tell them. And either way, I can assure you someone's going to get offended. It's just a no-go. Fortunately, I've not had any people engage in massive battles about this. And I'm not somebody who engages in that anyway. I don't write to confront. I write to tell a story. So yes, Sarah, I've had a few people say, I know one lady particularly said to me, she said to me that you're quoting a Bible line incorrectly. And I engaged with her, spoke to her, and that was that, you know. So I'm not, as trite as it sounds, I'm not God's PR agency. That's how I've always seen it. To me, my faith is incredibly strong in a really, really beautiful God. But at the same time, as Christians, we have to acknowledge that there are things that are wrong and have been told wrong and have been done wrong. We have to acknowledge that.
Thank you, Liezel.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to put on the group, and I
Thank you.
started typing it. If anybody would like to follow your work, your website, am I correct? www.liezelgraham.com.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so that's in the chat box. If people visit that, they can also sign up for your monthly or your newsletter when it goes.
It's not monthly. It's not.
Okay.
I'm a very reluctant newsletter writer. I promise you won't get spammed.
So when you do feel the spontaneous need to create one, people can subscribe to it on the website as well. Yeah.
Yes, and they can find their way from there. They can find. I'm very active. I share most of my stuff that I share on my author page on Facebook. I share to the website as well. But they can find their way from there to all the other links.
Wonderful.
Excellent.
Anne, would you like to end for us, please?
Well, just a huge thank you for coming to talk to us. As I said earlier, we've been exchanging happy dancing people because you were coming to talk. And just, you know, that original conversation that Nicky and I had about you being our people, you know, you speak our language, and your talk today was just so warm and loving and just so accepting. So thank you so much. We really have appreciated you coming.
Thank you for having me. It was really lovely. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Liezel.
Thank you, Rhonda.
Thank you.
Was there anything you wanted to say in closing, or anything you wanted to read to end our time together with, Liezel?
Just a very big thank you. And if there's obviously anyone, you know, who is experiencing this type of thing, to know that your life is worth leaving it behind. I think that would be the most important thing. Your life is worth stepping out of that and pursuing it. Yeah.
Thank you so very much for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we hope to be in further conversation with you, Liezel.
Thank you.
In the future. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
All right.
Thanks, Nicky. Thank you, everyone.